Beneath the scorching golden dunes of Abydos, hidden from the romanticized gaze of modern tourism, lies a crime scene over 5,000 years old. When archaeologists first breached the burial complexes of Egypt's First Dynasty, they did not just find the remains of kings. They found the crushed, meticulously arranged skeletons of hundreds of young men and women, servants, guards, and concubines. They were not victims of a plague or sudden battle. They were systematically slaughtered, strangled, or poisoned, their bodies placed around the royal tomb to serve a dead dictator in the afterlife. This was the violent dawn of the Pharaohs, a civilization born not just from the mud of the Nile, but from absolute, unyielding human sacrifice. The ancient Egyptians sold us a story of divine order, of gods walking among men in perfect harmony. But the forensic evidence left behind in the sand tells a much darker, far more sinister truth. This is the story of history's most successful, most ruthless, totalitarian regime.
To understand the psychology of this empire, you must first look at the prison they lived in. Egypt is a geographic fortress, a narrow strip of fertile mud surrounded by thousands of miles of lethal, unforgiving desert. The Nile River was their lifeblood, but it was also a mechanism of ultimate control. The state owned the water. The state owned the land. If you dissented, if you rebelled, you could not flee. To walk into the desert was to walk into certain death. This geographical isolation created a pressure cooker of obedience. The people were trapped in a beautifully gilded cage, entirely dependent on the centralized power that controlled the grain silos. The pharaoh was not merely a king. He was the sole arbiter of reality. He controlled the weather, the harvest, and the very concept of truth. In such an environment, tyranny does not just thrive. It becomes a religious necessity, violently enforced and unquestioningly accepted by millions who had nowhere else to run. The unification of this narrow land was not achieved through diplomacy or mutual agreement. It was forged in a bloodbath. Around 3100 BC, a warlord from the south named Narmer marched north. The artifact that commemorates this event, the Narmer Palette, is widely celebrated as one of the earliest historical documents in the world. But look closely at the carvings. It is a piece of state-sponsored terror propaganda. Narmer is depicted as a towering giant, gripping a defeated northern rival by the hair, his mace raised to shatter the captive's skull. Below him, the decapitated bodies of his enemies are lined up in neat, methodical rows, their severed heads placed carefully between their legs. The message carved into the stone was absolute: submission or total annihilation. The foundation of the Egyptian state was built upon the normalized display of spectacular violence, designed to break the psychological will of the conquered and instill a paralyzing fear that would last for millennia. As the dynasties progressed, the methodology of control evolved from mere physical violence to something far more insidious: psychological dominance through architecture. When the Third Dynasty ruler Djoser commissioned the first step pyramid at Saqqara, it was an unprecedented leap in human engineering, but it was also a weapon of mass intimidation. Imagine being a peasant whose entire world consists of mud brick huts and reed boats. Suddenly, you look toward the horizon and see a mountain of solid stone, perfectly geometric, rising into the sky. It defies nature. It defies logic. The pyramid was a constant, looming reminder that the state possessed limitless power, capable of bending both stone and human labor to its will. The architecture was designed to make the individual feel utterly insignificant. The pharaoh was no longer just a man with a mace. He was an immortal architect of the cosmos. Djoser's monument sent a chilling message across the sands: resistance against the builder of mountains
is entirely feudal. The architectural obsession reached its terrifying zenith on the Giza Plateau. The Great Pyramid of Khufu is often shrouded in the mystical nonsense of alien builders or lost magic. The reality is far more grounding and far more brutal. It was built by human hands, millions of massive stone blocks, quarried, dragged, and hoisted by an immense, heavily organized workforce. Forensic analysis of the workers' cemeteries at Giza reveals a grim picture of this divine labor. Skeletons show severe spinal trauma, crushed limbs, and severe osteoarthritis. These people were worked to the absolute physical limit of the human body. The state mobilized the entire nation, not through slavery in the traditional sense, but through a suffocating system of taxation and religious obligation. To refuse the work was to jeopardize the cosmic balance, inviting famine and chaos. Khufu drained the economic and physical vitality of his kingdom to ensure his own immortality, turning the entire population into expendable cogs in a colossal, stone-moving machine. But absolute power is a fragile illusion, and eventually, the climate broke the god-kings. At the end of the Old Kingdom, a catastrophic shift in global weather patterns caused the Nile floods to fail for decades. The state, built on the promise of agricultural predictability, completely collapsed. The resulting era, known as the First Intermediate Period, plunged Egypt into an apocalyptic nightmare. Historical texts from this era, like the autobiography of the provincial governor Ankh-Tifi, describe a society devouring itself. Warlords fought over dwindling grain reserves while the population starved. The texts speak of an unthinkable horror, claiming that people were driven to eat their own children to survive. Tombs were ransacked, and the central authority was shattered. The psychological trauma of this collapse left a permanent scar on the Egyptian psyche. They learned that the gods could abandon them, that chaos was always waiting just beyond the riverbank, and that survival required a ruthless, unyielding grip on power at any cost. Order was eventually violently restored, birthing the Middle Kingdom. But the state that emerged from the ashes of famine was fundamentally changed. The new pharaohs, beginning with Mentuhotep II, did not rely merely on the illusion of divinity. They built a highly paranoid, heavily militarized bureaucracy. The government became a surveillance apparatus. Scribes meticulously recorded grain yields, tax debts, and the movements of citizens. The southern border in Nubia was fortified with massive mud brick castles that rivaled medieval European fortresses. These were not just defensive positions, they were customs houses and checkpoints designed to tightly control trade and crush any indigenous uprisings. The Middle Kingdom pharaohs were pragmatic, cynical rulers who understood that fear and bureaucracy were far more effective than religious ideology alone. They instituted a standing army and a harsh penal system. The era of blind faith was over. The era of the police state had officially begun, meticulously documenting every aspect of a tightly controlled society. This fortified illusion of security was shattered by an enemy they never saw coming. From the deserts of the Levant came a wave of foreign invaders known as the Hyksos. They did not conquer Egypt with overwhelming numbers, but with terrifying technological superiority. The Hyksos brought the horse-drawn war chariot and the composite bow, weapons the isolated Egyptians had never faced. The chariot was the ancient equivalent of a heavily armored tank, fast, mobile, and devastating. The Egyptian infantry, armed with simple copper axes and spears, were slaughtered. For the first time in their history, the Egyptians were ruled by foreigners. The psychological blow was devastating. The cosmic order had failed them completely. The Hyksos settled in the north, demanding tribute and subjugating the native dynasties in Thebes. The Egyptians were forced into the humiliating position of a vassal state. It was a dark, suffocating century of occupation, brewing a deeply ingrained xenophobia that would soon explode into an unprecedented campaign of vengeance. The War of Liberation was initiated by a Theban king named Seqenenre-Tao, and the forensic evidence of his death remains one of the most gruesome discoveries in Egyptology. Seqenenre's mummified body was found hastily embalmed, his face twisted in a permanent agony. High-resolution scans of his skull reveal a horrific story. He was brutally executed on the battlefield, an axe smashed through his forehead, a dagger plunged into his neck, a mace crushed his cheekbone. He was surrounded and butchered by Hyksos soldiers. But his violent death became a powerful catalyst. His son, Ahmose I, took up the mantle, fully adopting the enemy's chariot technology. Ahmose waged a relentless scorched earth campaign, driving the Hyksos out of Egypt and pursuing them into the Levant. He did not just want liberation, he wanted annihilation. This brutal war forged a new, highly aggressive military doctrine. The Egyptians decided that the only way to protect their borders was to push those borders outward, violently expanding into foreign lands. The expulsion of the Hyksos birthed the New Kingdom, an era of unprecedented wealth and imperial expansion. Yet the most fascinating political manipulation of this era came from within the royal palace. Hatshepsut, a royal widow, orchestrated a bloodless, incredibly calculated coup. She did not just act as regent for her young stepson, she declared herself full pharaoh. To justify this shocking break with tradition, she waged a brilliant campaign of psychological warfare. She commissioned elaborate reliefs, claiming she was the biological daughter of the supreme god Amun. She dressed in male royal regalia, wearing the false beard of the pharaohs to project traditional authority. She secured the loyalty of the priesthood and the military elite through immense wealth generated from strategic trade expeditions like the famous voyage to Punt. Hatshepsut ruled through sheer intellectual dominance, manipulating the state's religious apparatus to legitimize an entirely illegal reign, masking her usurpation with the gleaming veneer of divine destiny and economic prosperity. But power seized is often power contested. When Hatshepsut finally died, her stepson Thutmose III ascended to the throne he had been denied. His revenge was methodical. He initiated a state-sponsored damnatio memoriae, meticulously chiseling Hatshepsut's name and image off monuments, attempting to erase her existence from the historical record. But Thutmose III was not just a bitter heir, he was the greatest military mind in Egyptian history, the Napoleon of antiquity. He led 17 brutal campaigns into the Levant. At the Battle of Megiddo, he demonstrated a tactical genius that is still studied in military academies today. While his generals urged caution, Thutmose forced his army through a narrow, highly dangerous mountain pass, catching a massive coalition of rebel Canaanite princes completely off guard. The resulting slaughter and siege secured Egypt's dominance over the Near East. Thutmose III transformed Egypt from a wealthy kingdom into a sprawling, aggressive empire sustained entirely by the plunder and tribute of subjugated nations. Empire brought unimaginable wealth, but it also brought a dangerous concentration of power within the priesthood of Amun, who controlled vast estates and gold reserves. To break their stranglehold, the pharaoh Akhenaten initiated the most radical and terrifying cultural revolution in ancient history. He abolished the traditional pantheon. He banned the worship of Amun and closed the temples, plunging the nation into spiritual darkness. In their place, he installed a single abstract deity, the Aten, the sun disk, and declared himself its sole conduit. This was not a peaceful religious reformation. It was a hostile takeover of the state's wealth. Akhenaten uprooted the entire royal court and tens of thousands of citizens, forcing them into the harsh desert to build a brand new capital city, Amarna. The regime became a totalitarian cult of personality. Art was distorted to show the pharaoh as an alien-like grotesque figure, emphasizing his separation from ordinary humanity. Dissent was entirely invisible. The state's grip was absolute. The golden reliefs of Amarna depict a royal family basking in the warm, benevolent rays of the sun god, but the graveyards of the city tell a horrifyingly different story. Modern excavations of the commoner cemeteries at Amarna reveal the dark, hidden cost of Akhenaten's utopia. The bones of the workers, many of them children and teenagers, show extreme signs of malnutrition, scurvy, and relentless physical abuse. Spines are fractured from carrying heavy loads of stone. The mortality rate was astronomical. The city was built with terrifying speed, fueled by the disposable lives of the peasantry who were marched into the desert to satisfy a mad king's obsession. While Akhenaten composed beautiful poetry to the sun, his people were starving and breaking under the whip. The Amarna period was not a time of enlightenment. It was a brutal, forced labor camp disguised as a religious sanctuary, exposing the ultimate sociopathic detachment of absolute power.
The Amarna nightmare ended shortly after Akhenaten's death. The throne eventually fell to a child, a boy named Tutankhamun. He was nothing more than a puppet manipulated by the power-hungry vizier Ai and the ruthless general Horemheb. Under their control, the boy king was forced to dismantle his father's religion, abandon the desert city, and restore power to the priesthood of Amun. But Tutankhamun did not live to see adulthood. His death at the age of 19 remains shrouded in intense suspicion. His skull shows signs of trauma, his ribs were smashed, and his burial was rushed, shoved into a small, repurposed tomb. As soon as the boy was sealed in the dark, the general Horemheb seized the throne. Horemheb erased Tutankhamun, Akhenaten, and the entire Amarna bloodline from the official king lists. The military had staged a hardline reset, violently crushing the heretic legacy and rewriting history to ensure the military-religious complex would never be challenged again. The aggressive military posture of the new kingdom culminated on the dusty plains of Syria at the city of Kadesh. Here, Ramesses II, desperate to cement his legacy, marched into a catastrophic intelligence trap set by the Hittite Empire. Captured enemy spies fed Ramesses false information, leading him to isolate his personal division from the rest of his massive army. Suddenly, thousands of heavy Hittite chariots surged from behind the city, smashing into the Egyptian lines. It was the largest chariot battle in human history. Ramesses was completely surrounded, fighting for his life in a desperate, chaotic bloodbath. Only the sudden, lucky arrival of a reserve force saved the Egyptian god-king from total annihilation or capture. Yet Ramesses returned to Egypt and launched history's greatest disinformation campaign. He carved colossal depictions of Kadesh on temple walls across the country, portraying an overwhelming, single-handed victory. It was a complete lie, masking a profound strategic failure with spectacular state propaganda. The truth behind the propaganda at Kadesh was that the Egyptian military machine had hit its absolute limit. The war ended not in a glorious triumph, but in a grudging, exhausting stalemate. Years later, Ramesses II was forced to sign the first recorded peace treaty in history with the Hittites. While celebrated as a diplomatic breakthrough, the treaty was an admission of strategic exhaustion. The empire was bleeding gold and manpower just to maintain its borders. Ramesses outlived almost all of his heirs, ruling for over 6 decades and leaving behind a bloated, top-heavy administration. He built more temples and colossal statues than any other pharaoh, but this monumental obsession masked an empire rotting from the inside. The sheer cost of maintaining the imperial facade, of bribing the gods, and paying a massive standing army was stretching the state's resources to the breaking point. The cracks in the foundation of the new kingdom were becoming impossible to ignore. The final fatal blow to Egypt's golden age did not come from a rival empire, but from an apocalyptic wave of desperate refugees and marauders known as the Sea Peoples. During the reign of Ramesses III, the entire Bronze Age world collapsed. Empires in Greece and Anatolia burned to the ground. This highly organized confederation of displaced warriors swept toward Egypt by land and sea, intent on settling the fertile Nile Delta. Ramesses III waged a brutal, desperate war of survival. The reliefs at the Temple of Medinet Habu depict the terrifying reality of this conflict. Egyptian archers rained death upon the enemy fleets, while infantry engaged in close-quarters slaughter in the marshes. To prove the body count, scribes are carved counting massive piles of severed hands and severed genitals taken from the enemy dead. Egypt survived the onslaught, but the cost was fatal. The treasury was empty, the trade networks were destroyed, the empire was permanently broken. The desperation of the collapsing state soon infiltrated the most secure location in the empire, the royal harem. Ramesses III, the savior of Egypt, was betrayed by those closest to him in a meticulously planned assassination plot. A minor queen named Ta conspired with palace officials, guards, and even black magicians to murder the aging pharaoh and place her son, Pentuer, of the throne. Modern forensic science has finally uncovered the brutal truth of that night. CT scans of Ramesses III's mummy reveal a deep, lethal gash across his throat, cutting through his windpipe and major arteries. The god king was ambushed and violently dispatched in his own chambers. The conspiracy was ultimately uncovered, and the surviving papyrus records detail a vicious series of trials. The conspirators, including the treacherous prince, were forced to commit suicide, their names cursed for eternity. The divine aura of the pharaoh was forever shattered. He was just a mortal who could bleed.
As the new kingdom collapsed into the third intermediate period, the centralized authority disintegrated. Egypt fractured into warring fiefdoms, ruled by Libyan warlords in the north and the high priests of Amun in the south. The economy was in ruins, and the state needed gold. They found it in the most sacrilegious place imaginable, the Valley of the Kings. State-sponsored tomb robbery became official policy. The high priests, under the guise of protecting the royal mummies, systematically broke into the tombs of their ancestors. They unwrapped the bodies of Thutmose, Seti, and Ramesses, violently hacking off golden masks and amulets, scraping the resin for hidden jewels. The ancient god kings were unceremoniously dumped into mass, hidden caches. The illusion of eternity was entirely abandoned for short-term political survival. The civilization that had spent thousands of years obsessing over the preservation of the dead was now cannibalizing its own history just to pay its mercenaries.
The slow, agonizing bleed of ancient Egypt lasted for centuries, culminating in foreign conquests by the Nubians, the Persians, the Greeks, and finally, the Romans. By the time Cleopatra, a Greek-speaking queen of the Ptolemaic dynasty, took her own life, the original spirit of the pharaohs had been dead for over a millennium. The temples were buried in sand. The hieroglyphs became an unreadable, forgotten code. The absolute power that had moved mountains, crushed rebellions, and sacrificed thousands in its name was swallowed by the ruthless indifference of the desert. The story of ancient Egypt is not a fairy tale of divine right and golden treasures. It is a chilling masterclass in authoritarian survival, a testament to the terrifying lengths a state will go to maintain control over the human mind and body. We gaze upon the Great Pyramid and marvel at human achievement, but listen closely to the wind sweeping over Giza. It whispers the ultimate, inescapable truth. No empire, no matter how brutal, can outlaw the dust.